Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the relationship between Poland and the Jews, especially with the families of Jews who lived in Poland before the Holocaust. Those whose property was confiscated by the Nazis when they invaded Poland, and then, after the war, that same property fell into the hands of the communists of Poland and was eventually inherited by the current democratic country of Poland. Poland has always made it very difficult for Jews to reclaim property lost because of the Holocaust, lost because their property was seized and confiscated by the Nazis. Now Poland is upping the ante. The Polish government has decided to make it impossible. The government of Poland is applying a statute of limitations of 30 years on all property claims. World War II ended 76 years ago. That means that even claims that are in the Polish courts, and some have been there for nearly 2 decades, are nullified. If a Jewish factory was confiscated in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the statute of limitations ended in 1969. That's absurd. It gets even worse. For decades, Polish government after Polish government put stumbling blocks in the way of Jews, even if there was a property deed itself, if there was a deed. As for the chances of actually having a property deed, that's not very likely at all. For a Jew of Polish ancestry wishing to reclaim property, that deed, that simple piece of paper, would have had to survive expulsion from their home, to life in an overcrowded ghetto, to starvation, to deportation from the ghetto, to transport to work camps, or even to death camps. We know the chances of a person surviving, but not a piece of paper? It gets even worse. Poland had a pre-Holocaust population of Jews of 3 million. Before the war, Warsaw was the second largest Jewish city in the world. The first was New York City. Over 90% of the Jews of Poland were murdered in the Holocaust by the Nazis, either directly or indirectly by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And all along, Poland has required families of victims who themselves might be survivors to present proof of death in order to claim family property. You heard that correctly. People are required to present death certificates in addition to property deeds in order to claim property. The Nazis, as meticulous as they were in record keeping, did not provide death certificates. They murdered, they dug mass graves, they cremated. Death certificates were not on their agenda. Poland claims that they are not responsible for the actions of the Nazis. They are correct. That is absolutely true. The Poles today are not responsible for what the Nazis did. The Polish Foreign Ministry in Warsaw has released a statement that reads, quote, "Poland bears no responsibility for the Holocaust, which was a crime committed by the German occupiers, among others, against Polish citizens of Jewish nationality," unquote. The current Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, made the point even sharper when he said, and I'm quoting here, "I can only say that as long as I am the PM, the Prime Minister, Poland will surely not pay for the German crimes. Not a zloty, not a euro, not a dollar." Ethically and legally, this attitude by the government of Poland is problematic. While it is true that the Nazis confiscated the properties after the war, Polish communists took over all the stolen property. And then, when the communists were ousted, the democratic Polish government, the government that is still in power today, inherited all those properties. So for the past 70 years, the citizens of Poland and their government have gained and enjoyed and prospered from those properties. Property they never paid for. Property that was stolen. Restitution is the moral act, a moral act for Poland, but they refuse. There is a thriving Jewish community living in Poland today, and Poland's chief rabbi, Rabbi Michael Shudrich, was invited to address the Polish Senate committee debating this law for reclaiming property. The Senate is the higher house of the Polish representation. The Jerusalem Post reported that the committee meeting and quoted Poland's chief rabbi as saying, and here's the quote, "One of the 10 commandments is, 'Thou shalt not steal,'" unquote. He continues saying, "This property was stolen twice, once by the Germans when they occupied the country, and the second time by the communists after the war. The current Polish government is the successor to the communist one, albeit very different. And thou shalt not steal continues to apply 60 years and 80 years after a theft happened, unquote. Shudrich is correct. Poland is struggling with its past. There's no doubt about that. There's no historical doubt that Poland was conquered and occupied and ravaged by the Nazis in World War II. And in order to live with themselves and to justify the role they played during World War II, the people of Poland have chosen to change history, to revise history, and to see themselves as victims of the Nazis. And that's where the historical accuracy ends. Citizens of European countries during the Holocaust were divided into three groups. Some were victims of the Nazi horrors. Some were collaborators with the Nazis. But the vast majority of the citizens of Europe who were occupied by the Nazis were simply bystanders. Bystanders. Most Poles were bystanders. The Poles were simply trying to get by and survive the awful situation that was going on around them. Today, Poland is trying to maneuver and massage the message and transform themselves from bystander to victim. Psychologically, it's much easier to live with yourself and to tell your children and grandchildren that you were a victim of Nazi oppression than to tell them that you did nothing and simply watched as atrocities took place around you. That might make Poles feel better, but Jews, the primary target of the Holocaust, the real victims, are being victimized once again, this time by the government of Poland. Coming up next, points of view. I want to discuss two columns today. The first is from Ynet, and the second is from the Jerusalem Post. The Ynet column is entitled, "Not the Palestine We Dreamed of or Were Promised." This column is brutally honest. It was written by a Palestinian intellectual named Dalal Irikat. She's an academic. She's also the vice president and assistant professor of conflict resolution, diplomacy, and strategic planning at the Arab American University in Palestine. The subtitle of the column is, Opinion, if we agree citizens have a natural right to full transparency from their governments, the Palestinian Prime Minister must share the results of the investigation into the death of Nazir Banat in PA custody and the recommendations that came from the Committee of Inquiry. It was published on July 9th, 2021. Nazir Banat was a Palestinian activist involved in politics and human rights. A very vocal critic of PA leadership, he was arrested by the PA security forces and mysteriously died while in their custody. Irikat begins. While growing up in Palestine, I learned that freedom of expression was one of the most sacred rights that a person could enjoy, and that it was the foundation upon which any democratic system was based. This is reinforced by the United Nations Charter, which links freedom of opinion and expression to the goals of the United Nations, indicating the universality and necessity of this freedom, especially in the 21st century. Irikat now writes something akin to what I would write. This is a first. She's an insider, still living under the thumb and total control of the PA, and she is taking a huge risk writing this, and a bigger risk by publishing it in an Israeli news site. Irikat writes, what we have witnessed recently in Palestine regarding freedom of opinion and expression is worrying and must be rejected. Moreover, resorting to addressing errors through the executive authority in everything related to public opinion is in itself a dilemma. In 2018, the executive dissolved the Palestinian Legislative Council, and for 15 years Palestinians have not exercised their right to vote to choose their political representatives. What happened in Palestine is abnormal and contradicts the Palestinian Basic Law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all human rights conventions. Irikat now describes the abuses, arrests, and even the murder of people who speak up against the abuse. She says it must end, and this is how the column concludes. The policy of arrest and detention for investigation upends the scales of freedom and earns fame and reputation for those who dream of it. Serious action is now required to protect the rights of the victim and the family. Respect the rights of every member of the steadfast people. Prohibit repetition of the scene. Reorient the compass that has deviated from its national path and work to achieve national unity to end the occupation. What we witness today is neither the Palestine we dreamed of nor the Palestine we were promised when the Palestinian National Authority was founded. The Palestinian people deserve that their human rights be protected, and above all, deserve freedom. This is an exceptionally bold and heroic column that Ericot writes. Hopefully, more voices like this voice will stand up and challenge the abuses within the PA, and hopefully justice and freedom and democracy will win. Know this, and this is an important notice. This is not an issue of Israel abusing Palestinian rights. It is Palestinians abusing Palestinians. Next up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It was written by Naomi Grant, and it was published on July 10th, 2021. The title of this column is The Problem with Foreign Aid for Gaza, and it's subtitled, If the international community truly wants to aid Gaza residents, purging Hamas's influence and completely restructuring UNRWA would be far more effective than money or concrete. Naomi Grant is the Director of Communications at the Endowment for Middle East Truth, which is also known by its acronym EMET, which means truth in Hebrew. Solving the dilemma of how to funnel aid to the Palestinians is essential to helping rebuild Gaza. It should be clear that this is not good enough, and it's simply not good enough to take anyone's word for it, certainly the people like Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, that when they claim that the money will be directed away from Hamas and Islamic Jihad towards the people, or towards building and rebuilding Gaza. I agree with Grant, by the way, and this thesis is very clear. This is how she begins. Egypt has recently discovered that brokering an agreement with Hamas, the designated terrorist organization that governs the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority, which governs part of the West Bank, might be impossible, given that the two sides have been at war with each other since 2007, following a violent coup by Hamas, and it doesn't matter that this agreement is concerning reconstruction from the 11-day war in May. Even Palestinians have long accused both Hamas and the PA of corruption. Both parties insist that they should be the sole group in charge of rebuilding, and that all aid must go directly through their respective governments. The international community has yet to learn, but Hamas should never be trusted. There is certainly a problem. Hamas would prefer to rearm than to rebuild, and Grant explains this. She writes, some 55% of Hamas's budget is allocated for its military needs, while less than 5% goes to improving the Gaza standard of living. And international organizations' aid comprises 65% of the total investment in the Gaza Strip. Hamas senior political leader Ismail Haniyeh recently racked up a bill of over $1 million at the Mandarin Oriental in Doha, a five-star hotel, obviously. While meanwhile, the war that Hamas had planned beginning on May 9th led to the deaths of hundreds of their own people, as Haniyeh preached to the world fairly successfully about how poor the Palestinians are, unquote. Hamas is not interested in medical aid or in relieving the suffering of Gazans, while their only interest is maximizing Israel's suffering. This is how Grant puts it. Hamas is infamous for its exploitation of international aid. 2018, Hamas refused Israeli medical aid, despite hospitals suffering shortages. They even set conditions for receiving Israeli aid. Rather than using the 3.5 million tons of construction material that entered Gaza just in 2016, for example, to build schools or apartments, a substantial amount is diverted to create more tunnels through which its militants can illegally enter Israel. In 2009, the United Nations temporarily stopped sending aid to Gaza because Hamas siphoned off 200 metric tons of rice, 100 metric tons of flour, 3,500 blankets, and 400 food parcels that were meant to go to its populace. Grant concludes her column by correctly asserting that nothing is safe from Hamas's influence in Gaza. She writes, "Nothing in Gaza is safe from Hamas's influence. Not schools, not American news outlet headquarters, and not even hospitals. International aid to the victims of the recent war sounds righteous, but it often causes more harm than good when it allows Hamas to restock weapons. UNRWA, the obvious body to take charge, has been heavily influenced by Hamas for years, leading to essentially zero monitoring of hundreds of millions of dollars. Several countries, including the United States, Germany, Egypt, Qatar, and the EU, have pledged to send aid, and due to a lack of coordination resulted in a pledged $1.4 billion, despite estimates placing damage in Gaza at $322 million. This further incentivizes Hamas to start wars during which they know Israel will retaliate. If the international community truly wants to aid Gaza residents, purging Hamas's influence and completely restructuring UNRWA would be far more effective than money or concrete. This is a well thought out and well written critique. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 7 cartoons and memes today. The first 3 are about electric cars and charging. There has been a lot in the news lately about these cars and how they are powered, and it's fascinating to learn how people are engaging with the idea of electric cars. This first example is a meme. There's a picture, and then it reads, a gas-powered van towing a diesel generator, charging an electric car. The future is stupid. Second up is a picture of the actor Peter Falk, who starred as the bumbling detective on the television show named Columbo. He's named Lieutenant Columbo of the LA Police. He was hilariously funny, and even though he made himself into a simpleton, Columbo always found his way to the truth and arrested the guilty party. His famous line was, "Just one more thing." This meme reads, if your electric car runs out of power on the interstate, do you walk to the charging station to get a bucket of electricity? That's funny. This third cartoon it sort of asks a question about language and the electric car. A dinosaur is asking, is it still called the gas pedal on an electric car? Good question. The answer is yes. Next up is a meme of a situation that we have all experienced and have yet to find an easy solution for. Everyone struggles with this, and I mean everyone. The meme reads, sorry I haven't gotten anything done today. I've been in the produce department trying to open the stupid plastic bag. I've got to tell you, it is one of the most difficult things that I've ever encountered, is opening those bags. I've been intrigued by the number of memes and cartoons poking fun at the younger generation over the past few months, and their inability to cope. This one is just so funny. It's a picture of a rusty toy in a playground. Growing up, we used to call it a merry-go-round. It was great fun. You spun at great speeds, upside down. You dragged your feet. You throw others off it. You ran up and jumped onto it. You often threw yourself tumbling to the ground when you threw yourself off it. This meme, which is in the form of a tweet, reads, the single reason my generation is tougher than yours. These last 2 cartoons poke fun at the Iranian election. The first shows 2 hands with fingers used to vote. The one hand has a blue fingertip symbolizing someone who voted yes. The second hand is missing a finger, and it's red, symbolizing a no vote. This last cartoon depicts the newly elected Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, who was, we all know, the presumed winner from the very start because he had the backing of the supreme leader. Tongue-in-cheek, he asks or says, what, I won? Did not see that coming. It was a real nail-biter. But now we can get this country fixed again. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The Israeli search and rescue team that came to Surfside and helped reshape and direct The dig to more effectively discover bodies has returned to Israel. The work at Surfside is not yet complete, but the Israeli team successfully taught the Americans how to safely and effectively search and find bodies in the aftermath of the building collapse. The role of the Israeli team was essential to the success of the grueling and daunting task. Miami-Dade Mayor Daniela Levine-Cava thanked the Israeli battalion for their unrelenting dedication and presented them with an honorary key to the county. The team was divided into 2 sub-teams. Each sub-team worked 12-hour shifts to find the bodies. As the Israeli team left Surfside, they marched out in formation. People, family members, locals clapped. It was a solemn clap, a sad clap of appreciation. The team marched and sang a Hebrew dirge. They sang Ani Ma'amin. Ani Ma'amin means I believe. It was an extremely powerful moment. We all know about the Delta variant of coronavirus, but have you heard of Delta Plus? Delta Plus is a mutated form of Delta, too similar to get its own name, but still a little different. Like Delta, Delta Plus was first discovered in India, and now a handful of cases have also been found in Israel. If the Delta variant is more contagious than the Alpha variant, Delta Plus is even more contagious and deadly than Delta. It is still too early to understand what is happening, but information and research about this new variant is coming out daily. One would think that by now, the medical community would know so much about the Delta variant and be on top of this, but not so. The standard PCR test, that's the test that we all take, which is offered everywhere, does not identify the variants. The test just identifies the presence or lack of the virus. And that makes the work on understanding, tracking, and determining the nature of the various variants so very difficult. Israeli Antiquities Authority has announced the discovery of a glorious and lavish set of rooms from the Roman era adjacent to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The structure was built only a few decades before Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the Temple in the year 70 CE. The rooms were actually discovered decades ago, but they were only now being opened to the public. Now people can visit these rooms alongside other architectural finds and archaeological finds at the other sites near the Western Wall and underground in the tunnels there. They are literally tunnels that run underground parallel to the walls of the temple. The rooms, like all the digs in the tunnels next to the Western Wall, are not digs per se. Actually, over the centuries, more accurately, over the millennia, the rooms and the structures remained intact. They were never actually destroyed, these rooms themselves. They were filled with dirt, sewage, rubble, and remains from other destructions, but they survived because of it. That fill needed to be cleared out, and in the fill were items left over after the destruction of Jerusalem and from other periods. The fill, which served to preserve the rooms, needed to be sifted and clearly identified. And that fill, those items discovered in the rooms, help us understand what happened above ground in the gloriously preserved and newly opened Roman rooms. Tensions are rising along one of Israel's perennial fault lines. Subsidies for Haredi families have been cut, specifically subsidies for childcare. Minister of Finance Avigdor Lieberman has chosen to change the child care entitlement program that has been in place as far back as memory goes. Lieberman plans now to require fathers to work or study in non-religious educational accredited institutions for at least 24 hours a week. None of the traditional Haredi yeshivot are accredited. The child care credit amounts to between 900 and 1,300 shekel per child. In a total, 130,000 families benefit from these subsidies every year. The Labor and Welfare Ministry spends 1.2 billion shekels on these benefits, approximately a third of which traditionally went to Haredi families. Of the Haredi population, 53% of working-age men are employed, as compared to 85% of working-age men in the rest of the country. Changing the eligibility criteria for child care subsidy will impact the economy. The rationale behind the subsidy was always to put children in daycare, thereby freeing up mothers/wives so that they could go to work. If not for subsidies, they would have to remain at home taking care of the children. We will see what happens now. It's way too early to tell. Iran has, for all intents and purposes, declared war on the United States, in Iraq, and in Syria. Over the past several weeks, the United States forces have been targeted by Iran's proxies almost every day. Even the United States Embassy in Baghdad has been attacked. The attacks come in the form of missile strikes and drone strikes. The drones being used are becoming more and more sophisticated. To date, thankfully, no personnel have been killed. And now, the United States has begun to strike back. Iran has an agenda. The Iranian leadership is ratcheting up tensions in order to force the United States' involvement, to goad the United States into conflict with their proxies. Iran wants the United States to hurt. Iran wants the United States to suffer the loss of U.S. lives. That hurt will come as events escalate. Iran does not care about the lives of their proxies, about those who will bear the brunt of the U.S. counterstrikes. Iran cares about Iran only and exclusively. Israel has begun hacking and seizing Hamas Bitcoin accounts. The Israelis have also hacked into the seized Hamas cryptocurrency accounts of all types. How did they do that? How did Israel successfully hack and confiscate Hamas's Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies? Notice, I'm not asking why, just how. The U.S. Justice Department is doing the same thing, attempting to hack into and seize the accounts of as many terror groups as they can. So far, Israel has seized about 150 cryptocurrency accounts, while the United States has seized about 300. The answer as to how Israel broke into the supposedly super stealth Bitcoin system is brilliant. While crypto accounts are nearly impenetrable, they have a weak spot. The weak spot is the point of transfer. That's when the accounts, the information, the owners are easier, not easy. Just easier for the white hat hackers to access. That's where Israel entered the system, and that's how they were able to seize millions and millions of terror assets. Israel's frozen the accounts. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. I mentioned an archaeological discovery, a Roman room near the Kotel, near the wall, deep underground in the tunnels there. Israelis love archaeology, and there are many reasons why Israelis love archaeology. The most important reason is that archaeology tells the personal history of every Israeli. It tells the history of Israel. Another important reason is that archaeology is proof positive that Israelis belong in Israel. Almost every Israeli is an amateur archaeologist. For fun, for vacation, in schools, Israelis visit archaeological sites and connect to the past. They walk where Abraham walked and where the Holy Temple once stood. They relate to the greatness and to the destruction. In Israel, Jewish history and archaeology is not an academic subject. Archaeology and archaeological discoveries are front page news. Everyone's interested. For Israelis, archaeology is family history. It's a passion, and it is a national pastime. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.